That great French diplomat, Maurice de Talleyrand, admitted once that he was more afraid of an army of 100 sheep led by a lion than of an army of 100 lions led by a sheep. Because in matters of leadership, lions are what you want, and sheep are not. Okay, but what happens if inside here you're a lion, but on the outside you look like a sheep? What do you do then? It's a problem that many great leaders have had to face, not looking the part. And their traditional solution has been to call in the sculptors. Because if there's one thing sculpture is really good at, it's turning sheep into lions. How do you sculpt a leader? Someone you want to look up to and follow. Someone who'll guide you and inspire you. It's one of sculpture's oldest problems. If you look like him, but you want to come across like him, then it's no good relying on nature. She's already let you down. The only firm friend you have, the best friend you have, is sculpture. It's something that all societies of all persuasions, in all eras and all places, have always known. When you need to come up with a leader, get sculpture in to do the job. Imagine you're a sculptor and you want your work to stand out. What do? Well, if you're clever, you might come up with some sophisticated, attention-seeking strategy that gets your work noticed in subtle ways. But if you're not very clever and you're in the Midwest of the United States, where people generally prefer the old-fashioned approach, you might do what sculpture has traditionally done to get itself noticed. You'll grow very, very, very big. In sculpture, equality has never really caught on, as you can see. 4 great presidents of the United States, carved into Mount Rushmore, advertising their country's democratic values by being so much bigger than anyone else. Sculpturally speaking, mountains are dangerous places. Not just because people fall off them, but because their visions grow weird and grandiose when they get to the top. You know, Hitler decided to found the Nazi Party while looking down on the rest of us from the top of a German mountain. That's what happens to people on mountain tops. They lose their sense of perspective. The 4 presidents, Washington, Jefferson, Roosevelt, and Abe Lincoln, are said to represent the spirit of America. And Mount Rushmore is seen by many as a sculptural shrine to American values. but it was actually built to be a tourist attraction. South Dakota needed a landmark, something big to bring paying visitors into the state. So, in 1924, they came up with this. 4 extra large Big Brothers crammed onto one hill. The great white fathers of America staring sternly down on their people, like a band of rock gods on the cover of a heavy metal album. The sculptor, Gutzon Borglum, was an unpleasant piece of work. He came from a polygamous Mormon family with 2 interchangeable mothers. So my guess is that somewhere along the line, Borglum developed an oversized father complex. But that's just my guess. Borglum was actually a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and he's on record as saying that the European politician he admires most, because he got things done and he saw off the commies and the Jews, was Mussolini. Which figures, doesn't it? The statues were originally going to be full length, taking up the whole of the mountain. But money was tight and people got realistic. Besides, the 4 disembodied presidential heads seemed to do the job of representing America's past adequately enough, which I suppose they do, if this is your idea of America. The actual carving, or rather the dynamiting, because most of this was created with dynamite, was done between 1929 and 1941. So the story of Mount Rushmore coincides rather neatly with the rise of fascism in Europe, which, I suppose, could be a coincidence. The local Indians, to whom the mountain actually belonged, weren't overly enamoured either of the sight of 4 white conquerors staring down at them so sternly. It looks like a giant paperweight, they complained, correctly, as they accused Borglum of turning their sacred mountain into Disneyland. Among the protests was a particularly effective one, mounted by a group of Lakota Indians who took their lives in their hands and formed a human chain across the mountain, where they proceeded to urinate in unison down the great presidential noses of the founding fathers. I know the feeling. When you gotta go, you gotta go.
Generally, it's good to be tall. Individuals who are taller are afforded benefits throughout their life. Individuals who are shorter receive just the opposite. We literally have to go back 120 years in American history, covering 42 presidential elections, to find a person shorter than the national average who was elected to be president. If we go back those years, we go back literally to 1888. Benjamin Harris, at the time, was an inch shorter than the national average. That was the last time that we've elected a person shorter than the national average.
The most famous whopper of the ancient world, and I'm sure you've heard of it, was the Colossus of Rhodes. It was 110 feet high, a nude of the sun god Helios, put up in the harbour of Rhodes to celebrate a great victory over Alexander's generals. This isn't it, by the way. This is about half the size. The Colossus of Rhodes only lasted about 50 years. Then an earthquake took it out, snapped it off at the knees. And when it fell to the ground, people could have a good look at it. And according to Pliny the Elder, the thumb was so big that most people couldn't get their arms around it. And all the fingers were the size of an average statue. Going big was a popular international strategy in the ancient world. The Egyptians did it, the Chinese, and, oh my, the Japanese. But no one was quite as keen as the Romans. Now, you must be an intelligent and educated person, otherwise you wouldn't be watching this film. So I would like to ask you 2 questions. The first one is easy. What's the name of that building over there? It's the Colosseum, of course. But the second question isn't so easy. Why is that thing called the Colosseum? Not because it's colossal, although it is, but because right in front of it, in this space here, there stood, for over 1,000 years, a colossal statue of the Emperor Nero. Now, Nero, as you know, was not a modest man. So he put up in front of his famous golden house this gigantic likeness of himself. This thing was bigger than the Colossus of Rhodes. It was 130 feet tall. You couldn't miss Nero's Colossus, so after his death, his successors found an excellent new use for it. By swapping its head around, they found they could give it a new identity. And by the time it ended up here, it had become a sun god again, Apollo. Nero's Colossus was supposed to have magic powers. There was a famous prediction about it by the Venerable Bede. As long as the Colossus stands, predicted Bede, so Rome shall stand. When the Colossus falls, so Rome shall fall. And when Rome falls, so falls the world. That turned out to be wrong, because sometime in the Middle Ages, the Colossus by the Colosseum was indeed pulled down and melted. But at least it had awakened inside the Italians their huge appetite for big sculptures. Book of Samuel 1:17. And there came out of the camp of the Philistines a champion called Goliath, and his height was 6 cubits and a span. 6 cubits and a span. That's more than 10 feet. Florence, the Duomo. Many people's idea of the perfect Renaissance building. But the Florentines themselves weren't satisfied with the way it looked. See that parapet up there, where the buttresses are that hold up Brunelleschi's dome? Does that look empty to you? Because it did to the Florentines. And for much of the 15th century, they wanted to put something up there to complete the apse. The original idea was for a group of great big prophets to go all the way around the church. That didn't work out. So somebody came up with the notion of putting a great big David up there instead. And Saul said unto David, Thou art not able to go against this Philistine, for thou art but a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth. David was the unofficial patron of Florence. The idea of this little shepherd slaying the giant Goliath with a rock appealed mightily to the Florentines. They identified with it. And in around 1500, when the famously wicked Cesare Borgia turned up at the city gates and menaced Florence, the Florentines did what every human society has done since the beginning of time. They roped in sculpture to work some magic for them and to sweeten the gods. And David took 5 stones out of the brook and put them in his shepherd's bag. And he took his sling in his hand and he drew near to the Philistine. The marble block for a giant David had been lying around in the cathedral gardens for most of the 15th century. Various sculptors had tinkered with it. No one quite knew how to finish it. So the Florentines finally summoned a man who could, Michelangelo, and commissioned him to carve the first Colossus seen in Italy since Roman times. It might be the most famous statue in the world, but there are 3 things wrong with David. 1, he's naked. Look at him. But if you were going into battle, would you go into battle like that? 2, he's not circumcised. Look at him. And he's supposed to be. The Bible is very specific on this topic. David was circumcised, Goliath wasn't. But it's the 3rd thing that's most wrong with him. He's just too big. David is supposed to be a little man who slays a giant. That's how everyone else portrayed him. People often say that his proportions are wrong. The head is too big. Look at that huge right hand. But remember, he was originally meant to have gone on the parapet at the top of the cathedral, much, much higher than this. So Michelangelo has cunningly adapted his proportions. And there's no real need for all the detail up there either. Look at the tendons standing up on his neck, the veins on his right hand, and that strange frown on his face. Is he puzzled? Is he angry? I can never tell. When David was finished, the decision had to be made where to put him. Everyone saw at once that he was much too fine a sculpture to hide away on a church roof. But where should he go? Leonardo da Vinci said, put him here. Botticelli wanted him here. Ghirlandaio, somewhere over there. And yet, he ended up here, in the single most symbolic spot available in Florence, right in front of the Palazzo Vecchio, the town hall, from where Florence was ruled. They had to move a Donatello statue that was already standing there, because the Donatello was thought to have had a bad influence on Florentine history, whereas this David, well, he could see off any invaders, and he could certainly see off Cesare Borgia. So here we have some of the most developed minds in the Renaissance world, fretting over the power, the magic of sculpture and its ability to influence history. Because you don't have to be an African tribalist to imagine that sculpture has all this potency. You just have to be human.
People who see something bigger assume it to be more valuable, more powerful, something that they want more so than something that's smaller. If we go back through history, we have always, people around the world have always viewed people taller to be more powerful, to be more valuable. If we go back further to the evolutionary process and we see how we've evolved, well, certainly individuals of taller height were able to defend better, were able to bring prey in. They were able to sustain or survive more. So we value that height, we equate with that height. So it's an evolutionary process.
There are around 2.5 million islands in the world, and many of them are, of course, very beautiful. But only one that I know of sends a shiver up my spine when I hear its mysterious name and envisage its mighty ghosts. I think you know where I mean. Easter Island. There's nowhere else like Easter Island. It's terrifyingly remote. Go east and eventually you get to South America. Go west and eventually you get to Tahiti, but only eventually. So the first people who managed somehow to arrive here, the original Polynesian settlers, must have been seriously reckless and brave travellers. And they must have liked what they found here a lot, because they stayed and they thrived and they multiplied. Boy, did they multiply. In those days, the entire island was covered with trees, and the surrounding seas were packed with fish. There was plenty to eat, plenty to drink, plenty to celebrate. And to thank their gods for bringing them here, and for looking after them so well, the Easter Islanders began mass-producing their unforgettable sculptures. They're called moai. Haunting things, aren't they? With those sunken eyes and that determined thrust of the chin. They're scattered right around the island. There are places here where there's another moai on every hill. The theory is that these things began life as portraits of actual people, important tribal chiefs, great ancestors and leaders. But one of the things that makes sculpture so potent is its ability to turn a likeness of someone just like that into an idol, something to worship, a god figure. And that's what happened here. The leaders became gods. I don't know if I've ever been to an artistic site quite as wacky as this one. It's the quarry where all the stone for the moai was mined. And every crevice, every overhang seems to contain another statue in a different stage of completion. I mean, look here. Nose, mouth, chin, it's a moai. And up here, it's the belly, chin, nose. They're everywhere. This one here, El Gigante, is the largest statue ever started. He would have weighed over 150 tons when he was finished, so perhaps it's best if we don't wake him. The statues were carved up there at the top of the mountain, then pushed down the side so they slid to the bottom, down here where they were finished, and then transported to all corners of the island where they stare so fiercely into eternity and keep their divine mission so close to their chests. They're so mysterious that various crackpots have proposed ever more silly explanations for them. Some say they were made by visiting aliens. Another theory is that they came out of the centre of the Earth in a giant earthquake. Here's another Easter Island mystery, a real one. When the first Europeans set foot on the island in the 1720s, most of the Moai weren't standing up as they are now, but lying on the ground, like this one. Some with their face up, some with their face down. Everyone assumed that the statues had been toppled by a natural disaster, a tsunami, or an earthquake. But then they began to notice a pattern to the destruction. And it slowly dawned on them that the Moai had been knocked over by the Easter Islanders themselves, deliberately. There'd been some sort of revolution, and the statues were at the centre of it. What on earth had gone on here? I'm not sure you'll believe me. It was all down to wood. Making the Moai and transporting them used up lots of wood for sledges, scaffolds, rollers. It wasn't a problem when the island was covered with trees, but as more and more trees got chopped down, the forests shrank. No wood meant no canoes. No canoes meant no fish and no escape. Thus, the islanders found themselves trapped on their ex-paradise with nothing to eat and no way of getting out. So they took it out on the gods who had betrayed them. They took it out on the statues. I don't know if you can make out these paintings up here. Weird figures, half man, half bird. Because this cave is one of the key sites associated with the strange cult that took over from the statue builders. It was called the Birdman Cult, and its story is as wacky a tribal turn-up as you're ever likely to hear about. Easter Island society was divided into two main classes. The privileged, who built the statues and who were known as the long ears, and everyone else, the short ears, who worked for them. What seems to have happened is that all the resources and attention lavished on the statues by the long ears fermented these huge angers among the short ears. When food was plentiful and the going was good, the short ears were happy enough to listen to the long ears. But as the population grew and the forests shrank, so the resentment of the short ears exploded into a remarkable revolution. The Birdman cult that took over the island, the cult of the short ears, had little time for sculpture. They were too busy thinking up strange new rituals by which to run their society. It was like the Bolshevik Revolution, tribal style. The cult was centred on this lost world of a volcano up on the island's rim, Rano Kau. It's on the other side of the island from the quarry. And over here, see the rocks up ahead? They are covered with strange, ritualistic drawings. Birdmen, half bird, half man. You can't really see them very well now, the light's wrong. You have to look really carefully. There's 3 here, see? Upside down, with their heads down. 1, 2, and over there, 3. And out there, see the large island at the end? That's Mota Nui. That was the cult's most important destination. Every spring, large numbers of nesting birds, sooty terns, would arrive on Mota Nui to lay their eggs. The islanders used to harvest them and eat them gratefully. And it was around this annual arrival of the birds that the Birdman Cult evolved its nutty rituals. When the birds were due, the young men of the island, the warriors, would swim across to Mota Nui, and they'd race themselves to see who could come back with the first bird's egg. Now, you can see the waters out there. No one would like to swim through that. It's about a mile there and back, and there are a lot of sharks in there. But these warriors, the Birdman cultists, they did it because the reward for the warrior who came back with the first egg was enormous, because they got to rule the whole of the island for a year. But only a year. And when their reign of 1 year was up, someone else had to be chosen. And they all went through the same thing again. The Birdmen have left us some interesting scratchings on their stone eyrie. And Kevin Costner liked their story so much, he turned it into a Hollywood blockbuster that plays in town twice a week. But that's hardly a legacy to compare with the astonishing achievements of the statue builders. Quite a story, eh? An isolated society makes sculpture the centre of its existence, devotes everything to it, and, as a result, it perishes. That's sculpture for you. And the Lord said unto them, Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Not everyone is as good as the Easter Islanders were at turning men into gods and then enlarging them. Some societies are really bad at it, but it's a powerful urge, and it seems it can't be stopped. Rising out of the water in front of the solid rock mega church in Monroe, Ohio, is the biggest Jesus in America. He's 62 feet tall, weighs 16,000 pounds, and is, indisputably, a difficult Jesus to miss.
They put him there deliberately so he'd be visible from the interstate. The Colossus of Ohio, a giant advert for salvation beckoning all passing drivers. Unfortunately, you get a lot of heathens driving up and down here who've completely misunderstood Jesus' big gesture of salvation. And they've nicknamed him cruelly the Drowning Jesus. Or sometimes, and I think this is even worse, the Touchdown Jesus.
End over end, neither left nor to right. Straight.
The Big J is the brainchild of Pastor Lawrence Bishop and his wife Darlene Bishop, who've been pastors here since 1978. This is their mega church, and from here they spread the bishop word.
Straight through the heart of them righteous uprights. Drop kick me, Jesus, through the goalpost of light. Yeah, drop kick me, Jesus, through the goalpost of light.
This Ohio mega Christ is the work of a sculptor called James Lynch. Now, I've never heard of him before, but apparently he's worked at Disneyland, and he made that huge Neptune at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. So he knows a thing or two about sculpting gods and what size they should be.
Well, for me personally, I think Christ is big. He's a big thing to my life. And I think a 62-foot tall sculpture of Christ reflects how big God is. And from a practical standpoint, if we made him much smaller, it would not have been much of a witness to the people on the highway, which is who we're wanting to witness to. But again, I think it represents how big Christ is.
Drop kick me, Jesus, through the goalpost of light.
So the best view of the big Jesus is from the garage across the interstate. I'm just looking for some people to ask about it. No, we're just asking questions about the big statue of Jesus out there.
I don't believe in statues.
You don't believe in statues?
No. Read your Bible.
We're here from British television. We're just making a film about big statues, and you've got a very big one out there.
Yeah,
How do you like the big Jesus?
It's a great place for us to tell people where we're located. Everybody in the state of Ohio knows where the statue of Jesus is at. You know, it stops people on the highway.
It looks cool, dude.
Yeah?
It's pretty big. Pretty big.
Is that a good thing, a big Jesus?
Yeah, that's pretty good. Don't matter what size it is.
Drop kick me, Jesus, through the goalpost of light.
We're back in the Black Hills of South Dakota, 8 miles from Mount Rushmore. Although you've probably heard of Mount Rushmore and its giant presidential heads, this statue here might possibly have slipped you by, though God knows how. Will you look at the size of that? Where does it come from, this mad American compulsion to carve up entire mountains? Anyone would think they were ridiculously competitive as a nation, or something. When it's finished, this entire sculpture will be the height of 2 football pitches piled one on top of the other. It's going to be the biggest sculpture in the world. You know, that head is 90 feet tall. This whole thing is going to be bigger than the pyramids. It shows Crazy Horse, the great Lakota Indian warrior, best known perhaps for whopping General Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. He was carved as a deliberate alternative to Mount Rushmore by a compatriot of mine called Korczak Żukowski, or as they call him around here, Kozak Zukowski. Żukowski was actually at work on Mount Rushmore with Gutzon Borglum when he was contacted by an Indian chief called Standing Bear. Standing Bear had a very American dream. My fellow chiefs and I, he wrote to Żukowski, want the white man to know that the red man has great heroes too. That was in 1939, and as you can see, it's still not finished. Żukowski spent the entire second half of his life, from 1949 until 1982, carving Crazy Horse. He never took a salary and received no government help. It was a labour of love, or perhaps a national duty. Since his death, his family has kept the carving going, and no less than 7 of the 10 Zukowski children are still involved in this great project. This is what it'll look like when it's finished, if it's finished. Crazy Horse didn't like having his picture taken. He didn't approve of the white man's camera stealing his face. So there are no actual photographs of him, just this vague likeness of any old Indian. And there are plenty of Sioux Indians around today who are as offended by this as they are by Mount Rushmore. The whole idea of making a beautiful wild mountain into a statue is a pollution of the landscape, wrote to the angry Sioux protester, Lame Deer. It is against the spirit of Crazy Horse. That's the downside of putting up great big statues of people. If your supporters can't miss them, then neither can your enemies. It's not a problem when you're in charge, but what happens when you're not? I'm in Lithuania, and this is the world's most notorious collection of Soviet-era statuary. Its proper name is the Grutas Park, but around here, everyone calls it Stalins World. This grotesque theme park was created by one of Lithuania's richest men, a former wrestler turned mushroom magnate, Waldemar Januszczak. The statues were bought from the Lithuanian government and then dotted about this fake concentration camp, surrounded by barbed wire and pretend guard posts. The original plan was to bring tourists here from Vilnius in cattle trucks, modelled on the ones that took political prisoners to the gulags. But mercifully, that idea was dropped. It's all in appallingly bad taste, but it serves a purpose, because it reminds us of the extraordinary lengths to which the communists went to blur the divide between their leaders and their gods. Lenin was small and spotty, but you'd never know it from the surviving statues of him. This one is the size of a seated Egyptian pharaoh, and some of them were much bigger, 20 meters tall. There was an old Soviet saying, the bigger the city, the bigger the Lenin. And they were everywhere. There was even one outside the Soviet ice station at the South Pole. The irony is that Lenin himself didn't want any of this. His deathbed wish was that there should be no monuments to him. But nobody was listening. Particularly not Dr. Konstantinis Bogdanas, a veritable churner out of Lenins who was single-handedly responsible for dozens of them. Dr. Bogdanas is now 75 and rather sick of the subject, but I've tracked him down to his studio in Vilnius, and I'm going to get him to talk about Lenin, whatever it takes. Hello. Waldemar Januszczak from London. London? This is the film crew. Studio. Studio. But when you were doing Lenin and the Soviet statues, how did you do them? Because obviously Lenin had been dead for a long time before you were born, huh?
In Leningrad, I came across a death mask of Lenin, so I bought it. I can show you. And there were lots of films about Lenin, so I could watch his movements. At the time, Lenin was worshipped like a god, but actually we didn't know much about him.
Could you portray Lenin in any way you wanted, or was there very close control of how he was presented?
Of course, there was censorship. One of my friends did a portrait of Lenin, and on his hands were some big visible veins. That could only mean that Lenin belonged to the labor classes. So the committee told my friend to change his portrait.
This is the statue of Stalin that used to stand outside the railway station in Vilnius. Imagine getting off your commuter train on a cold Monday morning and being greeted by him. Actually, statues of Stalin are rare because the moment he was dead, the relatives of the 2 million or so people he murdered began pulling them down and replacing him with Lenin. And then, of course, when the Soviet Empire crumbled, the Lenins were attacked too, and only a lucky few survive, thanks to the generosity of a mushroom magnate.
For the regime of Saddam Hussein, this was darkness.
So the moral to the story is, if you are going to put up big statues of yourself, make sure you live forever and are always around to protect them. Because big statues wind up your enemies something awful. And the urge to knock them down is every bit as powerful as the urge to put them up. There are a million stories in the world of sculpture. This has been a few of them.